Hello, and welcome to Old Ways in New Jersey. I'm Angus Crescalespi, your host, and today we're going to look at the traditions of duck decoy carving, specifically the decoy carving of the Delaware River region. There's a new book out called The Decoy Artist. It was written by David Giannetto, largely about his own father, Vincent. And we're lucky to have both Vincent and Dave with us in the studio today. As a matter of fact, it's also interesting, I should point out, that down at the Tuckerton Seaport, there's a whole exhibit based on this book. It seems that Vincent Giannetto, the father, became entranced with duck decoy hunting at an early age. As a 10-year-old boy, Vincent fell in love with the hunting lifestyle. He admired the old-timers who spent their days hunting and fishing, hanging around the campfire. He admired their lifestyle, living in freedom, living off the land. The old-timers had a special relationship with the wildlife and with the environment. But the old-timers, they did not readily share their secrets with Vincent. It took Vincent years to break into their closed society. Gradually, Vincent acquired the skills to become an expert carver. Eventually, his skills resulted in an invitation to the White House. Eventually, some of his work was placed in the Smithsonian Institution. Vincent's life story has been captured by his son David in this new book. David, the son, was an apprentice to the father Vincent. In time, David himself became an award-winning decoy carver. I'm pleased that this new book brings both father and son to our studio today. David, let's start with you. Your recently published book, The Decoy Artist, tell us briefly, what is it about?
Well, The Decoy Artist really, at its core, tells the story of a young boy who grew up in South Jersey along the Delaware River, and he got mixed in with some guys that were unique to that time. You know, they were living a life off the land. They were pursuing waterfowl, trapping small game. They might also fish, and they were living this life off the land. And when the boy encountered them while he's wandering along the river, he became enamored with that type of lifestyle.
Did he fall in with the wrong crowd?
Well, these guys are certainly outside the norms of society. You know, most of them, you know, they lived on the fringes. They were pretty shunned, but they loved the freedom that a life on the river brought with it. And being a young boy at the time, you know, he kind of placed these guys on a pedestal, became enamored with them, and fell in love with that lifestyle. So it tells, on one level, it tells the story of this boy who's trying to pursue a dream that's outside the norms and the cost that comes with that. So we wonder whether or not he'll succeed. But at the same time, it lets us tell what those guys were like and what this uniquely American lifestyle was. Central to that lifestyle of pursuing waterfowl is the hunting decoy. So it tells the history of the hunting decoy in America, how it started along the Delaware River, where it went from there, and talks about the destruction of the Delaware River, what the life in that region was like, and what it's become to today, all through the life story of what people consider the last of the old-timers, the last person to learn that lifestyle.
And that young boy is your father, right?
Yeah. I was lucky. I grew up, you know, being exposed to that stuff very early on, and it's been a big part of not only my life as a son, but my brothers and my sister and our family. It's had a huge impact.
David, I understand the first decoy carvers were actually American Indians. Am I right there?
Yeah, certainly. People generally consider decoy carving as one of the uniquely American art forms. Most of our art here in the United States comes from other countries originally, other cultures. However, the Native Americans hunted waterfowl, certainly with bows and arrows, so they made decoys out of reeds, and when the colonists came over, that was handed over to the colonists, and that's why we consider it uniquely American.
I guess there aren't that many folk art forms that are truly American.
No, we think of decoy carving and basket weaving as two that are uniquely American, but all the big ones like oil painting came from somewhere else.
Yeah. Now, based on my limited knowledge, if the American Indians were using decoys, I presume their weapons were bow and arrow.
Yeah, they were bows and arrows, and that created a certain style of hunting here, in America that they didn't have to pursue in Europe because they were using guns, so they hunted in a different style. And that's why when we hunt the Delaware River, the traditional way to hunt the Delaware River, it's a very intimate experience because you have to be very close to the ducks when you're hunting them. And that's the style of hunting that was handed from the American Indians to the colonists. And the guns they had at the time were fairly short-range weapons anyway, so they needed to be fairly close to the ducks as well.
I believe you had told me earlier that in the Delaware River that they would use a kind of a very small boat and sort of float downstream so that they would be amongst the ducks.
Yeah, when we think of hunting the Delaware River, the way they actually hunted it traditionally is not how we think of it being hunted. The ducks are smart enough to figure out that if they were close to the banks, they could get shot at. So when they wanted safety, they would go out to the middle of the river. So the river rats, the guys that were pursuing the waterfowl, had to go out and meet the ducks on the water, on the ducks' terms. So they would use these small boats, camouflage in front of them as trash, and actually go out into the river and drift into the ducks before they fired. So they were very close in amongst the ducks and the decoys when they actually shot.
Yeah. I picked up on something you just said a moment ago. You were calling these hunters river rats. Is that a term of disapproval?
Well, I think back at the time when the locals would call them river rats, I think it was that. But I think these men, they wore kind of like a badge of honor. That's a lifestyle they chose. They
turned it around.
Yeah, this is something they took great pride in. Their decoys on the Delaware River were so unique because so much of their own personality was caught up in the decoy itself.
Now, based on my review of American history, there was a time when these waterfowl were just plentiful. They practically darkened the skies. Tell us a little bit about the era of market gunning.
Well, market gunning, we think of generally as before 1900s, and that's a time where you could either as an individual or a group of guys go out and hunt waterfowl and then take them to local market or into the restaurants of Philadelphia, New York City, and sell them off, and that's a way to earn a living. They put an end to that sometime around the 1900s. And it still occurred. There was kind of a black market for the sale of waterfowl, or be traded locally, and it allowed these guys who were living off the land a means to still live that lifestyle, whether it was through a black market or just trading, the ducks for their meat to local residents who wanted to add duck to the menu.
So I guess this market gunning really wasn't for sportsmen. This was just a business.
Well, it was a business, so to speak, for the guys that were making a living off of waterfowl. When market gunning went away, of course, the population rose back up, and then you had a lot of sportsmen and hunting clubs along the Delaware River, and the well-to-do could go out and hunt waterfowl in the river with guides, and it also benefited the guys that we're calling river rats, or the hunter carvers on the Delaware, because the better carvers would sell their handmade decoys to the gunning clubs, and they would use locally made wooden decoys to hunt over, because even at the time there was some mystique over hunting over handmade decoys.
So if I'm not mistaken, then there's sort of a symbiotic relationship between the river rat or the hunter carver and the sportsman. They sort of need each other in a way.
Well, it certainly opened it opened a new market for the hunters of the river rats that were carving. But really,
the river rats
the
could
best.
serve as guides too, right?
I don't think it was in their nature to serve as guides. These
they
were
too
guys,
independent.
Yeah, they formed a small, loose-knit community on the banks, but part of that lifestyle was the freedom of it. They weren't looking to be part of a bigger group.
Well, let me follow up on that. The river rats, what's the upside of that lifestyle, and what's the downside of that lifestyle?
Well, you're living completely outside the structures of society.
So it's freedom.
So the freedom for these guys is huge. The downside is that, it's an unforgiving life. Most of them died fairly young, Most of them lived apart from their families. They didn't have any of the social structure, the support system that we would have or people in the local towns would have. But again, if you want that freedom, it's an incredibly appealing lifestyle to a certain group of people, and that's what, a 12-year-old boy mixing in with those men, that's how he saw it, and that's what he fell in love with.
Well, it's kind of masculine and risk-taking and adventurous, I guess.
Yeah, these are the same guys that would have opened the West if we were still moving west at the time. And
jumping ahead in time, how did duck decoys become collectibles?
Well, around 1950, the Delaware River was significantly changed when it was dredged again, and most of the meadows and marsh along the banks were filled in. Some of the islands were connected to the mainland.
Why was it dredged?
Well, it was dredged mostly because Philadelphia continued to grow as the industrial center of the colonies, and the Northeast was growing and producing more and more. There was a lot of factories along the Delaware River, and if you want to get larger keeled ships into the port and up the river, you needed to dredge it to make it deeper.
Okay.
Back then, the Delaware was very shallow. It was swift, like we think of the Delaware in North Jersey now.
Yeah.
So when it was dredged, they used that mud to fill in the banks and created a lot of new real estate for mansions along the river. But the impact of that was the destruction of the Delaware River. So for decades after that, very little or nothing lived in the Delaware River. And when that happened, of course, the waterfowl had to move to other areas, and that brought an end to this lifestyle these guys were living on the river.
So the river rats that we've been calling them, what are their decoys worth in the collectible market today?
Today they're worth a considerable amount. A single decoy like we're seeing here, I think the highest record at auction was just over $1 million. So those are decoys that probably would go back nearly 100 years from some of the more well-known of those river rats, guys that we think of as the legendary hunter-carvers of the Delaware River now. And the reason why we use a subtitle, America's Last Hunter-Carver, in the book is because as a 12-year-old boy mixing in at such a young age with these guys around their little campfires, my father was really one of the last guys that got to know them and learn the traditions of the Delaware River directly from interacting with these guys. And those are traditions that shaped not only his artwork as he progressed over the years, but also his life and my life and the life of my brothers and sisters and I.
Well, then if these decoys are worth so much, I assume that the families must have benefited.
No, that's one of the tragic stories. If you look at this, after the Delaware River was destroyed and the river rats either died off or went elsewhere, and the supply of decoys dropped so much, there weren't a lot left around, and they started to be having a dollar value attached to them. And remember that these guys were mostly living outside of their families to begin with, so they weren't valued. Decoys at the time that were destroyed or damaged would be thrown into the fire as firewood. So when a dollar value started to getting attached to them, the families didn't have any or couldn't afford. So somebody's father who carved or grandfather's carved, now their work was suddenly worth thousands of dollars. They couldn't afford to go back and buy it. So a lot of the descendants of those now famous carvers don't own a single piece of their work.
Wow. Well, let's turn to the source. Vincent, you brought along some samples here. Can you give us a sort of a step-by-step in the process of how you go about making a duck decoy using these?
Well, the first step is to know the bird. I think you have to get to see the real bird on the water. You have to go through books, mounted birds and such. You draw up a pattern which is cut on the bandsaws, the body, and you cut the head. First the side profile, then the looking down profile.
But you can't use a saw for the head, can you?
No, then you use, well, you can use knives, rasps. I use a Fordham tool, which is a motor with a flexible shaft and cutter heads, which is just
almost
quicker.
Like a dentist.
That's right. In fact,
yeah.
Dentists, Fordham tools also make the dentist tools.
Ah, okay.
Fordham company. So you rough out the body, putting the side pockets, the raised V on the back, which is very Delaware River typical. and you screw the head on until you get it all done. You sand it off, then you cut it in half and hollow it.
Well, why bother to cut it in half and hollow it?
Well, originally the boats were small. The weight was a problem. Plus it helps the floating to balance it. Then you screw the head on the top, glue the two pieces together, sand it, and I use artist oil paints, which you also could use acrylics, and this is the same bird finished. And that's all there is to it.
And what about the neck of that duck? Is that artificially solid because it's a working decoy?
Well, it has to be durable, and it has to take the everyday difficulties of hunting and in and out the boat and so on.
So if you were doing a purely decorative decoy, you might do the neck a little different.
Right. You'd thin it down, and you would do more dainty work, which wouldn't hold up in a hunting situation. So they have to be durable to last, along with likeness to species.
Yeah. Well, a moment ago, your son David gave us some hints about what was appealing to you as a young boy about that lifestyle, but maybe it'd be good to hear it from the horse's mouth.
Well, as a 12-year-old boy, these men seem to have a freedom that a 12-year-old boy doesn't have. So,
and you weren't particularly fond of school at this point.
No, I'd rather not be in school. I'd rather be down on the river with these fellas. And I was lucky enough that they kind of accepted me in the group, at least to let me hang around. And a lot of times I should have been in school, but that's where I was.
And I believe, as I recall from the book, one of the things you did to ingratiate yourself with these men was sometimes you'd bring a bottle of wine along?
Well, my in the area I was mostly Italian. They all made wine. So my grandfather made wine, and there was always wine bottles that you could...
So maybe he wouldn't miss one?
No, he wouldn't miss it. Plus, in those days, I could go into the liquor store and buy a bottle of something. All you had to do was tell them your father sent you in, and they would let you have it. So it was a little different back in those days.
And so that would help lubricate the conversation?
Absolutely. They would talk a lot more when the bottle got empty.
And then, as I recall from reading the book, as you went on through high school, you increasingly disliked school. And so your father sent you to a military academy.
Peekskill Military Academy up in New York along the Hudson. And looking back on it, at the time I was there, I didn't care for it so much. But looking back, it was the best thing that happened to me.
And following up on a question I posed to your son moments ago, this term river rats, could you call them river rat to their face?
Well, no, not at that time. It was a slur, and it wasn't used except for the townspeople to describe these people, like you might say a bum today.
Yeah.
And,
so what did they call themselves?
Oh, I don't think they called themselves anything, to be honest with you. They were just what they were, and they were hunters, and that's what they enjoyed being, and that's what they worked toward. And they made their decoys, and that was in an office around the water cooler. A man might brag about his income or his the car he drives or whatever. These men bragged about the decoys that they made and the boats that they had and such, and that was their value.
And I assume their prestige came from their success in hunting.
Absolutely. The man that hunted, killed the most birds and had the best rig was top man.
And as I understand from reading the book, although you admired these men and they tolerated you to hang out around the campfire, they didn't actually teach you how to carve.
No, they weren't.
Why was that?
They weren't so anxious to teach. What they learned, they probably learned the hard way, and they weren't so anxious to pass it on and make it easy for me, which looking back was probably the best thing ever happened, because I had to make my own patterns and figure my own way, and it made my birds unique compared to someone else's.
Well, did you go to the local public library? Did you subscribe to magazines?
Well, they weren't available at that time. There wasn't any books on decoy carving and pattern books and such like there are today.
There certainly wasn't an internet.
No, there wasn't at that time.
Huh. So you're just self-taught then, basically.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, how did these guys differ from the sportsman hunters?
Well, the sportsmen, they had a family and a job, and they did it on the weekends, and it was a hobby. To the river rats, it was their livelihood. They either survived or they didn't, depending on how well they hunted.
David one time told me that these river rats, they paid a high personal cost for their lives. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I didn't know a lot about their families because they didn't speak of them much.
Maybe they were kicked out.
They probably were. And looking back, I admired them in a lot of ways, but that's the part I didn't care for. Coming from a family that's still tight, I didn't want to give that up. So
you weren't willing to pay the same price?
No. But I did as close as I could come to it. But the family was more important to me than them.
Not putting words in your mouth, I assume your father must have disapproved of your hanging out with these guys at the river, or maybe you hid it from him.
He didn't know. He didn't know when I was there. He thought I was in school getting smart, but he had a different vision for me. He was a carpenter that had his own construction company. And in his world, if I wasn't nailing two boards together, I wasn't making a living. And he figured who would ever pay me for a wooden duck? So he couldn't visualize.
So he was a practical man.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you were increasingly thinking of yourself as an artist?
I always liked to draw and paint and whittle and what have you, and I still do. I think any man that can make his living at his hobby is a lucky man, and I consider myself lucky.
Well, from our earlier conversations, you told me, like after high school, you went into the construction business with your father. How did that work out?
Well, any son that's worked for his father would know how that works out. I worked for a while, and then I would quit him and work for somebody else, and then I'd come back and forth.
But meanwhile, you were doing the carving on the side.
Yes, right. And then when I was 30, I went into my own mason business, and I had that till I was 41. Then I went into carving full time, and I'm 67 now.
I'm sort of amazed. You can actually make a living at this?
I probably could have made more money staying in the mason business, but I made enough money to send 5 kids through college and support my family, which is all I wanted to do.
That's pretty amazing. So in terms of productivity, would you have to turn out a duck a day to maintain that lifestyle? Or,
Well, yeah. You had to get up in the morning and treat it like a job. Go out in the shop and spend your 8 hours. And I say 8 hours, and then when you come in and eat dinner, after dinner you did work in your chair, I painted or something. So it was a 24-hour day, 7-day a week, but it was one of these labors of love. So it's not really working.
I remember myself talking to some of the Barnegat Bay carvers. They would say like they would take the head and sort of whittle on that just while they're in the barber chair even.
Well, I think so, because they probably like doing it also. I would make these decoys whether people paid me for them or not. So I consider myself lucky.
Yeah, in a way, you never worked another day in your life,
That's
you
right.
could say. Yeah.
That's right.
And how did it feel when you got that phone call from the White House? Can you recreate that conversation for us?
It was... I found it confusing because I don't know
which White House you?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how they got my name really, other than the fact that I carved for 30 years and had done many shows and what have you. But I was very flattered and excited about it. I wasn't so anxious to go because it's just not my nature, maybe. But I did go, and I had a great time. And she was exceptionally warm and outgoing. And
who was this?
Mrs. Bush.
Oh, okay.
The youngest Mrs. Bush, right?
Wow.
So yeah, we spent the day there. We had lunch in the Lincoln room. We had dessert in another room.
What was the occasion?
It was a decoration for the Christmas tree. And they asked me to make an ornament for
Did
them.
they ask people from other states to
They asked 2 people from each state, I understand. It wasn't all wood carving. It was metal work and ceramic work and a lot of different art forms.
But they didn't try to hang the decoy from the tree.
Well, I didn't make a decoy. I made a cluster of baby ducks into an ornament.
Oh.
And you could make anything you wanted. It had to be, at that year, it was things great and small. And it was a bird from your area that lived in your state. So I made a cluster of baby ducks into an ornament, and she hung it. People made all sorts of different birds.
Did you ever follow up with the Christmas tree ornament business?
Well, part of you signed a paper that you wouldn't reproduce it and sell it as decorated in the White House. That was the only.
That's a significant catch.
Well, that's true. But I was quite honored to do it, and I, like I say, it was a great time.
Well, let me throw it back to David for a minute. You and I have talked about the Delaware River, the Delaware Bay, Barnegat Bay, but what makes the Delaware River decoy so special?
Well, if you're from a region and you grew up in that region, the decoys from your region are special because it's really the region and the environment of that region that turned the decoy into what it was for that area. The Delaware River decoy, because the style of hunting was so intimate, you had to hold the ducks in amongst the decoys for a longer period of time while the hunter drifted into them in a boat.
Okay, so the river's more constricted than a bay. It's maybe only 300 yards wide.
Well, it's just a completely different environment. It is a constricted environment in the sense that it's 300 yards wide, but a meadow or a marsh like you would find in Barnegat Bay, it's a very confusing environment. There's a lot of places to hide, a lot of places to go. And on the river, the ducks will go out to the center, and you have to go to them.
Of course.
So the decoys had to be more intricate in order to convince the ducks to stay there while the hunter approached them. In other areas, you typically shot at the duck when it came in. So because you had to make them more convincing to the real thing, they became more intricate over time. And because the men earned respect by their ability to be effective hunters, they were constantly trying to improve the decoy. So one of the real traditional marks of the Delaware River style decoy is that it continuously progressed over time. And the guys were always focused on how do I make a better decoy. And that's a tradition that you still see my father carrying. If you look at his work over time, you'll see a vast change in each decade of his life. In other areas of the country, once the decoy became an effective form, it really stopped progressing. So now you see a lot of modern-day carvers mimicking what was done 50, 75 years ago without continuing to progress.
And for a moment, back to the book itself, what exactly is narrative nonfiction?
Well, the book maintains an interesting place in the decoy industry. It's a novel, based on a true story, and it has about 120 illustrations that might span back 100 years. So I got to go to a lot of little associations and small museums in the Northeast and look at pictures that were just in cardboard boxes, as well as 75 or so photographs of my father's work. But it reads like a novel, so it's a story with characters, dialogue. And that's the modern way to write historical nonfiction. Because it allows the reader to read a story and follow a character and understand how they feel and think, their motivations for doing things. And it's nowhere near as dry as a traditional history book would be.
And finally, Vince, your advice to young people?
Well, it has to be a labor of love because when you sell the pieces, you might have to do things that you don't feel like doing, and you still have to be able to turn out the same quality. If people come to me and ask me to make a bufflehead and I feel like it, it's great. But if they ask me to make a bird that I don't feel like, I still have to make myself do it and stay at the same quality.
So it requires some discipline.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, David, Vince, thanks so much for joining us here in East Brunswick today. This has been fascinating.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you.